So welcome everybody. This is results training module 5. We're going to be talking about standards unit modifications, and this session speaks to doing those changes through ESF. My name is Michin Choi. I'll be your presenter today. I work as a consultant for Resource Practices Branch. And so on board we actually have Caroline Wood, who's going to be monitoring any questions people might have, and she can respond back. So sometimes people ask lots of questions and they come fast and furious. So today what we're going to talk about is, so that if you need to ask questions, chat is what we use. So you can type in your questions, but make sure you direct the question to the entire audience so they may read it. At the end of the session, when you sign off the session, there is an evaluation form, so please do complete the evaluation form so we can improve on our training delivery. If there's other people sitting in the session, you can also add their name to the response for the evaluation form so we can include them as far as how many people have attended the course. At the end of the session, within 24 hours, you will get an email, and this is for letting you know that if you are new to results and you need to get access to results, or if you are in a position where you have to renew your access, we do have a requirement now that you complete this test and pass it. So there's 2 themes to the test depending which role you'll need, whether you're a submitter or an approver. So in order to complete the test, you need to be familiar with the content for the first 6 modules of the training modules we offer. So it's not just this one course material, but others as well. So if you need to review the material on your own because you're not able to attend all the sessions, all the PowerPoints are available on our training website. So today what we're going to talk about is I have to provide you with background information about our key documentation, overview of the difference between online and ESF with respect to standards unit modifications, point to any technical documentation that will help out with deciphering problems you might have when you start doing your submissions. And then we're going to talk about the ESF process and go through understanding what kind of plan you have, and then going through each of the different kinds of standards unit modifications that there are available and how to set up your ESF file. And then we'll talk about how results audits this information online, and then resources for helping you out in case you run into problems. So most of you should know this already, but what happens is that results track silviculture obligations based on legislative requirements. And the core document that explains that is in this results information submission specification document. There's a licensee submission edition for those silviculture obligation areas. So it's really important for you to be familiar with the document because it goes and provides you with the reference as far as the legislation, understanding of what the requirements are for reporting. So this document is the form and manner that's been specified by the Chief Forester. And so it goes into explaining what's required, what the mandatory requirements are for all the different reports that is required for results. And this document gets updated periodically, and more recently there was inclusion of a requirement for reporting for basal area. So again, make sure you're familiar with the document, and there's other additions as well to deal with government-funded activities and woodlot reporting, as well as small-scale salvage. So the key here is that you need to make sure that you're using the right document for the reporting that you're trying to complete for results. So today we're going to talk about SU modifications, and the key here is that you have 2 ways in which to update this information in results. You can do it through ESF, or you can do it online. Today this session is going to talk primarily about ESF. It's really important to realize that when we're dealing with submissions to results, it's only through the ESF method that you can update spatial. So that's really crucial for you to know that. So while we have the online capability, when you're in a situation where you're required to do any changes to the standards unit, where you're adding, deleting, merging standards unit or anything that requires modifications of the area that normally require you to submit a new map, then you have to do that through ESF. When we're dealing with ESF submissions, what happens is that there's a lot of there's a bit of a learning curve if you're new to doing those submissions. And what happens is that people often get into a situation where they're getting errors, like their submissions are not successful. We have on our website a technical documentation website where our technical specifications are located. And in those specifications, you'll find that there is a specific section that speaks to ESF submission that goes into each individual element of the schema. So the schema, really what that means is that it's the format or the data elements that is comprised of what needs to be supplied to results. So for every element that is there in the ESF schema, you'll find that in the ESF component of the technical specification, you're able to look up what that data element is, definition, the optionality, whether it's a mandatory field or optional field or conditional field, as well as any rules that may apply to that particular field in terms of how it's processed. So it's really important that you know that when you do have an error, this is a reference source for you to go back to solve or understand how some of the edit processing rules are used, and perhaps you're able to understand what is the scope of the problem and able to fix your ESF document. So code lists are also available on here, so if you're new to results and don't know the full names of all the codes, then you have the ability to reference those as well online. And the last part, which is going to be the most important part, and we'll be talking about this in detail in this section, is this amendment update summary. I call this the standards unit modification cheat sheet. What this has in it is explains to you what kind of action codes you need to use, referring to the different SU modification options you have, as well as explaining to you what is allowed as far as adding, deleting SUs, as well as some of the restrictions of what's allowed to be changed or not changed, and also things you need to know about as far as how the document needs to be structured. And so I'm not going to go through this matrix right now, because during the course of the entire presentation we'll be going through those fundamentals each in turn. So, but the idea here is that when it's all said and done, if you're running into problems, you're able to reference this sort of summarize set of rules through the technical specification to help for you to refer to if you're trying to work on understanding how to structure your ESF submission for those SU modifications and what some of those rules are. So when we talk about the ESF process, we have different kinds of documents, and the first thing you need to know about is when we have ESF process, it's in that opening definition component of dealing with building a submission, where we have to specify an action code. When those SU modifications happen, it's in the opening definition where this piece happens, and we have a variety of different action codes available depending on what you want to do to a document. So when we're talking about SU modifications, we're talking about an opening that already exists in results. So in this case, it's already in there, and now for some reason you need to make a change to that document. So in the opening definition, you have to specify what action you need to inform results you want to make changes to. So we have, for Silviculture Prescription, action code of U for corrections, M for minor amendments. We have M as well for doing Section 197 rollovers, A for amendment for a major amendment requiring approvals, and then for site plans we have V for approved variations, A for site plan amendment, and we use A as well for Section 197 rollovers. For the situation of the Section 197 rollovers, the system will know it's a rollover based on certain criteria of how you set up your file and information that you provide, and we'll go through that also in the examples later on. We didn't create new action codes for those because any action codes is a schema change, and we are very careful with not making any schema changes because it has an overall impact on both results, the application for the overhead costs, and likewise for the licensee systems as well. So in this case, for dealing with Section 197 rollovers, we used existing codes that we had, but we set up the processing rules to be able to recognize the Section 197 rollovers automatically, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So the general process you need to be familiar with is when we're dealing with SU modifications, if you're the submitter, you have to go through a process of deciding what kind of plan are you dealing with, silviculture prescription or a site plan. What kind of change do you need to make to that document? Make those changes and maybe provide supplemental information. And in this case, when you submit the information through ESF, for those documents that do not require approval, once it's submitted, if it's accepted, then it's official. In the case of dealing with silviculture prescription amendments, in that one situation, what happens is that that document has to go for approval, in which case that document goes into the inbox in results, whereby then someone in the ministry side that has the approver role has to review the document and then decide to approve or not approve the document. So that's the general process of what happens to these documents. So the first step is to determine what kind of plan are you working with. So we have silviculture prescriptions in results, and the way results define silviculture prescription is whether or not there's the existence of this standards regime, standards ID. So that's the way in which results defines a silviculture prescription, while we recognize that there's other documents, like for the case of site plans for woodlots, they also are in this case, valid in this format as well. But in this case, the terminology we're using for silviculture prescription is whether or not there's this existence of that standards regime ID. What happens is that when there is no standards regime ID, the system will recognize this standards unit is a silviculture prescription, and online, what will happen is that you'll find that the buttons that appear are related to a silviculture prescription, which means that you have the options of doing correction, minor amendment, or a silviculture prescription requiring an approval. What's not documented here, but it's in our but it's in other pieces of documentation that we have, is that the minor amendment can be also used to do a Section 197 rollover. So from results perspective, what happens is that for site plans, if there's the existence of the standards regime standards ID, so this is a unique number that is representing an approved stocking standards that exists either in an FDP or FSP or a ministry default, the results system will then define this record as a site plan. And automatically then what happens is that the options available online is either an approved variation or a site plan amendment. And again, if you want to do a Section 197 rollover, it's possible to do it through the site plan amendment. But what happens here is that that's how the system defines the difference between a silviculture prescription or a site plan. We do have now site plans that exist in results that are under an FSP. And so the way results works is that if there is the silviculture, a standards regime, standards ID number that is approved for use, that is referenced back to an FSP, results will then link to allow you to be able to view that information for the FSP. And so what happens for results is that if there is that linkage for that approved stocking standards in an FSP in the tracking system, then what happens is that you are able to see which FSP this particular standards unit opening relates to. As with the site plan, what happens is that you have the ability to do an approved variation or site plan amendment. So if you are a person that have access to the tracking system. This is the Forest Stewardship Planning tracking system. You are able to click onto the hyperlink, and then that allows you to take you into the tracking system to be able to view the content of the actual FSP. So what happens is that with results, as I was saying, you have to figure out what kind of plan you have, and then once you figure what kind of plan you have, for each of the different kinds of plans you have to decide what kind of action you want to initiate. So silviculture prescription, you have the ability of doing a correction, minor amendment, a Section 197 rollover, and major amendment. So in the case of the corrections, minor amendment, and Section 197 rollovers, there's no approvals required, while the major amendment does require an approval process. So there's different steps that are involved as far as the processing of the information. And then in the case of site plans, we have the approved variation, Section 187 rollover, and amendments. And in all these cases, with respect to a site plan, there's no approvals required. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through each of the different possible actions that you have available to you. And then what will happen is that in some situations, I'll bounce into results applications so you can see some of the information that I'm going to be referring to in the slide deck. But this session is primarily to speak to ESF and the structure of how the information is supposed to be set up so that you can submit the information. But at the end of the day, it's also good for you to see how this information lands, where it's landing from when you submit that information into results, as well as seeing how this information is also tracked. So silviculture prescriptions, we have the ability to do corrections. The business perspective of what this is for is because for older records we have that were entered in prior to 2005, it was entered in by hand, so there may be some data errors, entry errors. And so corrections is simply allowing you to be able to correct the data to reflect the legal approved document that you have on your files. And so for some of these older records, we do not have online SP maps in some cases, and sometimes we do see maps that are in the system, but they may not have the internal line work for standards units because they may have been created through this opening spatial conversion process. So what happens is that you do see maps that are there. Sometimes there's no maps, but if the maps don't look right, it's just because it was a conversion process to allow us to create a coverage for opening spatial information. But if you do find that when you're involved with doing corrections, there is ability for you to update the spatial as well. So what happens is that to build the ESF file, what happens is that you have to, in the opening definition, state the action code that you're going to use. And so U is what we have for update, and that's another term we use for corrections for standards units. The key here is that it's important when you are building a correction document for a standards unit that the entire, all the standards unit must be provided in the document. And any standards unit, even though there might not be a requirement to make any changes to those data elements because they're correct, you still need to supply them in the document. If you miss any standards units, it's assumed that it's going to be deleted in the outcome of the corrections event. If you add a new SU, if you have a different identifier, SU identifier, than what is in the system is then going to assume that that is new SU. Any data elements that vary or is missing from your document will appear as blank or will show up as a changed field. And so with the corrections, because we're dealing with silviculture prescriptions, you're not allowed to include a standards regime ID. This is like the approved stocking standard unique identifier, because the concept is that this is a silviculture prescription, so you're correcting a silviculture prescription like for like, and so you're not allowed to make changes to that. And so in the component of the schema, there is the ability to also provide the rationale component. And that's the same situation for all the SU modification. It's really important. Correction, it's probably very self-evident, but as a standard practice, it's probably a good thing to make sure you write something in the rationale to provide context. The reason being is that in the case of these records that we're dealing with in results, they can last as long as 20 years in terms of their life cycle. So who's making the changes may not be in that same position in 2 years' time, and someone 5-10 years down the road are looking at this record and understanding that needs to understand the genesis of any changes that might have been made. And so if there's reasons for making certain changes, it's really good to provide the sort of rationale so that there's some context, because the fact of the matter is that the people who are going to look at this down the road will have to sort of trace back the chronology of what's happened over time. So the rationale is something that's important, and it needs to be used to help supplement that information to provide the right understanding of what's happened, why things are being changed. In the case of any of the SU modification, there's the ability to provide spatial information. So as I was saying, some of these records, if they're silviculture prescriptions, what will happen is that some spatial might not be there altogether. Some of the spatial might be a little bit not the same because it was a created process through that opening conversion. You can provide the spatial through your ESF submission. And then what happens is that when you submit the information, all the information gets tracked through two mechanisms. There is the SU history component and the history component as well. So what's going to happen is I'm going to go through the structure of how the ESF file should appear in a very high level component to illustrate how things will turn out. So in this example here in the first table, I have an original opening where I have standards unit 1, 2, 3 that appears in results currently. I want to now make a correction to something in the document because there was something incorrect about the information reflected in results. So in my ESF document, what I need to do is use the action code of U for correction. And in my document, if I put in standards unit 1, 2, 3 with whatever information that is supplied, what happens is the outcome will show up as a correction with each of the same standards unit 1, 2, 3 with the reflected updated changes. Remember, when you're missing data elements in your actual schema, then it'll show up as a blank. Any change data that is different between the standards unit, between the before and the after will show up as a changed component within the corrections. In this second table, I want to show, using the same conceptual opening of 1, 2, 3, in my ESF document, if I provide information about standards unit 2, 3, and 4, what will happen is that 2 and 3 will be updated with whatever the net changes that was supplied. But because standards unit 1 was not included in the document, it's assumed that it's going to be deleted. And because 4 is a new standards unit that did not exist initially, it's then treated as a new standards unit. So this is just to illustrate why, in this case, for correction, it's important to understand how the processing happens, because there's certain assumptions that are made depending on whether or not you're providing all the standards units. And if some pieces of the standards units are not there, or the standards units differ in their nomenclature, it's going to assume certain things in terms of how the information is treated as far as deletion or addition of standards units. In the corrections, we're not allowed to update anything in the standards regime ID because you're not materially changing the silviculture prescription, because it has to remain a silviculture prescription. You're just making some realignment of information to reflect the legal document that you have. And in the actual document itself, you have the ability to include the spatial information for the standards unit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into results just to illustrate a few things here. I just have to get in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into a test environment so that this way you get a chance to see information, but it's not someone else's licensee's data, because I know that later on sometimes I go in and make modifications to data, so this way I'm not actually changing production data. So just a word of warning, when I go into test environment, the data sometimes look a bit weird, and so it is really just so that I have examples to show you, but they are not real records that I'm playing with as far as modifying. So, and I'm not picking on any specific licensee on purpose, and this is test data, so some of it looks kind of real, but it's not, because we really kind of whale away at doing weird stuff with these records to do our testing. So in this case, I just wanted to point out that we have a silviculture prescription. Again, the determination of that from a results perspective is whether or not there's existence of the standards regime, standards ID. And what happens is that when there is actual changes that have been made to records, what happens is that we do have information tracked as the information is audited. And so what happens too is I wanted to show you when the information comes through, and this is ESF component, but I'm showing you how the information actually gets tracked online once it's submitted. When you have a correction, what happens is that the event comes through. Once it's accepted, it's official, the information now is reflected in the standards unit. But there's the ability to go back and look at the actual changes that had occurred under that event. So in this case, there was a correction. And when you go into each of the events using this issue history component, it allows you to see the before and after of the changed event, the changed data elements that was under that particular standards unit correction. And you can also scroll through the different standards unit to see whether other pieces of information was changed. So this is one way you can see how information gets audited in results, but being mindful that this information, this functionality only existed since 2008. Another way in which the information when you're doing issue modification is audited in results is through this history that's available. And when you click on that, the event that it's audited here in the event tracking history. And when you click on one of them, what happens is, like, there might be more than one. It shows you a different way in which the information is audited. And what it is it shows you the specific data element that was changed under that correction. So it's a kind of a different way of showing how information is tracked. This functionality of history with results has been in place since the inception of results. So this is like, it's got everything. So it doesn't just audit the issue modification, but it audits also other things that have happened for the opening as well. While the standards unit information, the standards unit history only tracks information starting 2008 onwards. We have these two ways of tracking the information, but what you need to know is that when you are doing these issue modifications, the information is actually tracked over time. So I'm trying to go back to my screen here. So the next action is the minor amendment. And so the minor amendment, again, we're still talking about silviculture prescription, is meant to make area adjustments based on better information from field surveys. So the way this works is that in your ESF file, the M code is for minor amendment. It allows you to only submit for the issue you wish to update. So it's different than the correction where it's like an all or nothing and assumed different changes based on if you have different SU nomenclature provided. In the case of minor amendment, you can only provide one SU that you want to change, or you can provide all of them, but you are allowed to provide only the SU that you wish to update. One thing also to note is that because the context of a minor amendment is to make just the changes to the net area, the pieces of information that's allowed for updating is only the BEC and the NAR. And there's also the exception of the stocking standards regime ID, but that is only when this code is being used for Section 197 rollover, and I'll talk about that next. But the idea here is that the information, the material changes for the standards unit for a minor amendment is just the biological classification or the net area to be reforested. Rationale is always there for you to provide context, and all the information gets audited. So in this case, for the structure of your ESF file, with our original opening of 123, if you submit a minor amendment and just wish to make changes to SU2, SU2 will only be changed and it doesn't touch 1 and 3. So what happens though is that the content of Standards Unit 2, the pieces of information will only get reflected and be updated as the BEC and the NAR. And there may be the occasional situation where you're doing a Section 197 rollover, in which case you'll put the Stocking Standards Regime ID, but it has to meet a certain condition to be understood as a Section 197 rollover. So the next action we have available for silviculture prescription is a FRPA Section 197 rollover. This has been set up so that it allows for licensees who chooses to manage their code cut block openings to be managed under FRPA. So what happened is that if those cut blocks, those code cut blocks have been identified in their FSP, in a licensee's FSP, and once the FSP is approved, then what happens is that the licensee has identified they want to now apply FRPA stocking standards to those Section 197 through Section 197. So what we've done in results is that we've tried to make that ability so that they can switch that Section 197 rollover, but there's no approval process because basically it has been approved under the FSP. But what will have to happen though in order to have this Section 197 rollover be recognized is that when they are applying that FRPA stocking standards to those code cut blocks, that the Section 197 rollover will only be recognized under a certain set of circumstances, and which is that the standards unit that you're trying to do the rollover for is for a silviculture prescription or site plan that's not associated with FSP already, and that the standards regime ID that's being used has been identified in an FSP, and that FSP has this Section 197 election box checked in the FSP tracking system. And I'll show you the screen that shows what that is about. And that the stocking standards regime ID that's being used has to be approved for use for the client and the org unit for the FSP. So all these conditions have to be met in order for the system to recognize it as a Section 197 rollover. So if you are involved with doing Section 197 rollover, the action code is M. And then what happens is that in this situation, you can actually provide a standards regime ID, but it has to meet these conditions of the FSP tracking system having that election box checked. And then you have the ability to provide a rationale explaining what you're doing. And so when I'm talking about that Section 197 election box, in the tracking system, this is FSP now, what happens is that if the licensee happens to have a bunch of cut blocks that they have identified that they want to roll over, then what happens is that they have to go into the tracking system and ensure that this FRPA Section 197 election for stocking standards is checked. So when that is done, what happens is that the approved stocking standards that's authorized under this FSP then becomes available for completing that Section 197 rollover in results. So there's this linkage that has to happen. And this information has to be completed in order to have the rollover happen. So this has to be looked after first. I don't think there's much of the Section 187 left. I think a lot of them happened a few years back, but this is just so that in case there is still a need to do that, you have to understand the mechanics of it and how it has to be set up in order for it to be recognized in results. So the way it works for Section 187 rollover is that in our original opening, we have SU 1, 2, and 3. And in this case, for dealing with rollovers, we use M, the minor code. But in this case, you are allowed to include the section, the standard stocking standard regime ID, but this is the stocking standard regime ID that belongs to an FSP with that election box checked. And you're allowed to supply just the standards unit that you want to roll over. And then once that's completed, if it's accepted, the system will recognize as a Section 197 rollover because of the fact that the regime ID that's been supplied matches the criteria of the fact that the election box has been checked. And so in this case, only the standards unit that was identified as the scope of what is in the ESF document gets changed with that SSID, and then this standards unit will appear as a site plan with that linkage to the FSP. So with dealing with Section 197 rollover, you can change BEC and NAR. You can change or add, in this case, the standards regime ID, and you can also provide spatial information. But there's no ability to update any elements within the stocking standards because it's understood here that only BEC and NAR are available, as well as just the standards regime ID are available for change. So now getting into, there's the Silviculture Prescription requiring approval, and that one has different sets of processing, so I leave that to the very end. So now I've moved into site plans and approved variation. So the purpose of approved variation is to allow for changes to the stocking standards based on the approved variation that's been pre-identified in the FSP. So what happens is that when the licensees are writing their stocking standards for their FSP, sometimes what happens is that they provide extra details of situations where they may apply for them to vary from the stocking standards. And those are called approved variations. So they could be for a variety of situations due to site conditions, concerns of certain kind of disease, or animal, sort of any kind of damage agents. It could be a variety of reasons, but the idea is that it's been identified in some element of those stocking standard preparation, and because they've been pre-identified to vary those stocking standards for those situations, and the FSP has been approved for those scenarios. When we get into now the applied situation where we have a standards unit where those situation does apply, and the licensee is now trying to say, okay, I need to use that approved variation because I've encountered a particular terrain situation, then now I have to do some variations based on what the site conditions are. So what happens here is that the approved variation is to meet that requirement. It's already been, those conditions have been pre-approved for use. So what happens is that they're saying some elements of the stocking standard needs to be changed to meet those conditions. So with approved variations, the way it works is that you have the ability to just update the standards unit you wish to change. But in this case, the stocking standards remain, the approved stocking standard or standards regime ID that's in the system remains the same. It's just some element of the stocking standard is being changed for the standards unit. And again, you have the ability to provide the rationale. In this case, it's very appropriate to explain why you're making that approved variation. and so it provides context for what is happening on the ground that requires you to make those changes. Once the approved variation is accepted, all information gets audited. So with the approved variation document, what happens is that the original opening we're dealing with is standards unit 1, 2, and 3. If you have your ESF document and you just want to make changes to standards unit 2, you're allowed to supply the document change just for standards unit 2. And then what happens is that the standards regime ID is not updatable, but you make whatever changes to the specific stocking standards that you need to. And then once it's accepted, that change is reflected. So one of the things that I haven't spoke about is that throughout the course of all the changes that we're talking about here, you can provide spatial updates. It's most crucial to provide the spatial updates when you're dealing with a situation that you're modifying the issues, where you're adding, deleting, or merging issues. So where you're making actual changes to the map, then the spatial information needs to be provided. So that's something that's sort of like an underpinning when you're doing these changes. While I'm talking about the sort of the data elements or the attribute component, the requirement to supply the spatial is based on whatever that is happening as far as the line work that needs to be updated. So it's one of those things that you have to use your judgment whether you're going to provide spatial because it's required. So we do have cases where we have FDP site plans where there's a requirement to do a rollover for those into an FSP. So what happens is that, again, these are pre-identified already in the FSP document. So these cut blocks that may have been site plans under an FDP have been identified and you want to roll them over. So results, what happens is that we use the action code of A for dealing with the rollovers. Because anything that has the A, the way it works is that you have to supply all the standards unit, and that's just the way the system processes the information. The other thing too is that when we're dealing with amendments, what happens is that you can't actually make changes to the standards unit once that standards unit's been declared. So while the document can provide the standards unit, all the standards unit information, the one that might be declared free going already, what happens is that you have to supply the standards unit exactly as the way it is in the system, because you're not allowed to make any changes to the standards unit legal obligation once the declaration has been completed. In the case of dealing with site plans, the standards regime ID is mandatory in the document. In this case, what will happen is that the standards regime ID will be reflected based on it being in an FSP with that Section 197 election box checked off. So as with the way it works with amendments, any missing issues, if it's not in the document, we'll treat it as a deletion, and any new issue identifiers will be treated as an addition. So that's basically how the amendment component works, but in this case we're dealing with rollovers. Again, you can provide the rationale, comments, and the information gets audited. So using the example here, if we want to do a rollover, you need to make sure you provide, if your original issue information, opening issues is 1, 2, 3, your document needs to make sure that you contain all 3 of those issues identical to what's been provided, with the exception of the standards unit that has the rollover component, in which case you make the changes to that stockings regime ID to reflect that change that you need to make to enable you to roll over into the FSP tracking system. And then once this is completed, the system will track it as a Section 197 rollover, and all the information will be switched to the information, the standards unit will be switched to an FSP site plan. So in this case, you have the ability of changing the BEC, the NAR, and the standards regime ID. And again, the spatial information can always be provided. The next one we have is site plan amendment. And so what happens with a site plan amendment is that you are allowed to add, delete, change standards unit, as well as applying different stocking standards to the standards unit. It's through the reassignment of the standards regime ID. So in the case of site plan amendment, we use the action code of A, and we have to make sure we supply all standards unit. If you don't supply the standards unit, then it's assumed that that standards unit is going to be deleted. If your standards unit nomenclature is different, it's going to treat that as an addition. Again, what happens is that any standards unit, once it's declared free growing, you cannot change the information for the standards unit. So the document has to include even the free growing standards unit, but the information for that standards unit for the free growing standards unit has to be identical to what is in the system. Site plan amendment requires the standards regime ID, so it's a mandatory field. And so any missing issues is treated as a deletion. Any new issues that don't exist previously is considered to be a new issue, and then all the information gets audited. So in our site plan amendment example, what happens is that our original opening of 1, 2, 3, if your amendment document has a change, whether it's the NAR, BEC, or the standards regime ID, if you include 2 and 4, what happens is that 2 is considered to be the changed component, depending on what the changed information is. But then because 1 and 3 was not included as a part of the submitted document, it's considered to be a deletion, and 4 is a new standards unit that is created. So that's how the amendment works. So again, site plan amendments or amendments in general require all issues. Otherwise, it has these assumptions about what's happened with those issues, and the same goes with corrections. So minor amendment and approved variation are the ones that allow you to just make changes to that individual issue without impacting the other issues. So, and then everything up to now that I've spoke about, so that's corrections, minor amendment, approved variations, site plan amendments, and Section 197 rollovers, everything that I talked about up to this point, if it's submitted, if it's accepted in the system, you don't have any errors coming through your ESF file, it's official. It's basically reflected in the system. So there's no approvals required. So it's really important when you're doing your ESF submissions, you know what you're doing and you make sure the data is set up correctly. I can't emphasize enough, there is no undos. When you submit that document and if it's accepted, some of the cases, if you're doing changes where you're using a new standards regime ID, all this stuff ripples through in terms of all the changes happens, and it's quite a lot of data changes that could happen potentially to standards units. And we don't have an undo button from results perspective, so to unravel the mess is not very pleasant, and it might require new submissions to undo or fix the problem, but essentially it still gets recorded as a new amendment, or so it's really important to make sure that you know what you're doing when you're submitting this stuff, because for a lot of these documents, if it's accepted, then it's official. So to unravel a mess is not a simple matter, and I can't emphasize that enough. So my next 2 slides will speak to the Silviculture Prescription Amendment component, because there's an approval process. So we're dealing with silviculture prescriptions, and the way it works is that we have the action code of A. And what happens is silviculture prescription has uniqueness to any elements of the standards unit. So all the different components of the stocking standards, like the density information, the preferred acceptable, minimum spacing, all that stuff is unique in a silviculture prescription. So if there's a requirement to change anything in a silviculture prescription, then what happens is that all that information needs to be provided in the document. Anything that's missing from what exists on the system will be considered a deletion. Any changed values that are different from what you have in your new ESF document versus what's existing, it's considered to be the change or net change for the amendment. And the SUs thing all over again, where if you need to provide all the SUs, if you are missing SUs, it's considered to be a deletion. If you have different identifiers, it's considered to be addition. So it's really important to make sure that you understand that structure for dealing with silviculture prescription amendments. So, and again, while any standards units that's been declared free growing, you're not able to make changes to those standards units. What happens though is that in the amendment document, that approved standards unit or that standards unit that's been now declared still needs to be included as part of your amendment submission. And what happens here is, unlike the other actions we talked about, because there is a requirement for approval, when you submit the amendment document and it's accepted, it means that the Silviculture Prescription Amendment document now is in what we call a submitted status. And this information is now going to be needing someone in the ministry's office to review. So it sits in the inbox and it awaits processing. So someone in the ministry has the district approver role, who then has to go in and review this to decide to approve or not approve the Silviculture Prescription Amendment. So there's this extra step that is involved when we're dealing with Silviculture Prescription Amendment. When you submit the amendment, there isn't a way to recall that back. So if you decide, oh, I submitted that, but oh my goodness, I made an error and I need to make some changes to it, the only way to deal with that is that you have to call someone in district office to not approve the amendment, and then it comes back to you and you have an opportunity to change that and resubmit the amendment. So you have the ability to do that for dealing with amendments. But what happens here is that, you know, there's a little bit of back and forth that has to happen, right? If there is some sort of error or mistake that has happened. But what happens is that once it hits the ministry's domain and they approve it, again, everything is official. It's reflected in the record that results has, and everything's tracked. So all information gets audited. So going to the structure of the amendment document for silviculture prescription, we have our original opening 1, 2, 3. Our ESF document has A for the action code, and the document, if I supply 1, 2, 3, the same nomenclature, all 3 SUs will be retained. Whatever net difference there are between my ESF document versus the original will be then reflected as part of the scope of the change for that amendment. In my second example, where we have the original opening 1, 2, 3, I do my amendment A. What happens is that 2, 3, and 4 is part of my ESF document, and then what happens is that 2 and 3 are considered to be the net changes that have occurred, whatever the differences are between the data that exists in both of those SUs. But SU 1, because it wasn't included, is now a deleted SU, and 4 is considered to be a new SU. So again, for the amendment, you have to provide all SUs, otherwise it's going to be assuming certain things about those SUs, whether it's addition, deletion. So when the submission happens, it goes into submitted status, and it needs to be reviewed by a ministry official in the inbox. And it's not until the opening is in approved mode, then, you know, it's only when the opening is approved, then the requested changes are reflected in the opening. So when it's in a submitted status, whatever is the content component of your amendment is still not official yet until it's been approved. So this shows you the information as it would appear from the ministry's approver inbox. And again, these are just sample data in our test environment, so it's not real. So someone in the ministry's role who has approver access would go into the inbox and they would click on submitted, and what will happen is that a list of different amendment openings will appear. And what happens is that their job is to go through and look at the details of the context of the amendment request. And what happens is that from the ministry's perspective, if you're in an approver role, what will happen is that you have to, if you hit approve, then you have this dialog box just to make sure, are you sure? And then you click yes. If it's approved, then what happens is that the opening now, the information content of that amendment will now be official. Whatever that was in the actual submitted data now will get reflected as the actual standards unit new information. And the opening now becomes in approved status. If for some reason there's a problem with the amendment, if the ministry decides to not approve, they're required to provide a reason why it's not approved. And what happens is whatever the information that's supplied in the reason is then sent back automatically to the licensee, so they get notification about the outcome of the opening. The other thing too is that when the opening, if it's not approved, that amendment is not approved, it switches back to this AMD, amended status. So from the licensee's perspective, you have to make a decision about what to do next. So you could go into results to delete the amendment, so you can start from scratch to supply or submit a new opening. Or you could take the existing opening, that existing amendment, and then make more modifications to it and resubmit. So, but the key here is that when there is a problem with the amendment where it's not approved, it is in this AMD status and it waits for a new action because it's kind of in this amended status. So just as a quick overview, so with amendments that require approval, when it's submitted, it goes into the submitted status, and what happens is that if it's approved, it automatically, the information content of the submitted status goes into approved mode and the information is reflected in the standards unit. If it's not approved, then something has to happen to the actual amended opening to either delete the amendment and start again, or reuse the same amendment but make some modifications to the information to resubmit. The other thing about when we have the records in submitted status, if there's a pending amendment that has to be that it's pending approval, what happens is that at this point in time, the opening is locked down for any declarations, because what happens is that the system will say there is a pending change to the standards unit, so there's no ability for you to do any declarations. So that's something else you need to know about when you have a major amendment or amendment, Silviculture Prescription Amendment requiring approval. When you have this submitted status, you still have the ability to still update information like your disturbance reporting, your silviculture activities, and your forest cover reporting. So that is still allowed, but it's just the declaration component, because it's tied to the standards unit. That part is locked down, so you're not allowed to proceed with any declaration until the standards unit, the amendment that's in the inbox is resolved, right? So that's just something for you to know about as well. So what happens is that when we do have information that comes through and it's complete as far as doing a SU modification, as I was saying before, this information is tracked in the SU history and the history component. So there's those two ways in which the information is audited. And so the key here is that this SU history component only existed since 2008. So any changes that have occurred in results as far as SU changes prior to 2008, the way to review that kind of change is via the history component. So that's something that you just need to know about, that there is only at a limited starting point of time where this issue history has started, and it's only since 2008. And so what happens is that for this issue history component to work, at the very bottom of every record that comes in through results, you'll find that there's a record that's called original, or if it's a newer record, it will have like electronic submission. And all that is a snapshot of the original opening record that exists in results. And so that then what happens is that for every new transaction that happens, any new issue modification, there is a reference point to then provide a comparison against. So that's how this works, is that the bottom is the baseline information record that the system had at that point in time, which was in 2008, and then everything else gets tracked, and you can see the chronological change since 2008. And so what happens is that when the information is reviewed, you have the ability to see the changes for the standards unit for the various different elements. The change data is in the red italicized to say this, to tell you that that's the field that was changed, and you have the comparison of being able to see the before and after. And the other way in which the information is audited is through this history component, but the format is different, where it just tells you the change data element only, rather than giving you a full snapshot for the standards unit. So that is pretty much what I wanted to show you today. The other screens are some reports that are in the system, but they're going to get retired, so there's no point talking about that. I want to just point to you, if you have problems, questions, we do have our application support webpage. So if you have questions, you might key in keywords, and then you might find that they've been already asked and there's answers posted. As well, if you need to talk to someone in a district, we have the list of the results district contacts. Important in the case if you're dealing with Silviculture Prescription Amendment, to figure out who your district counterpart is. And then if you're not getting much luck with looking up problems and trying to figure out using the technical specification documentation, we also have our application support people that can help you out as well. So that's pretty much all I wanted to show you today. I didn't want to show you the online stuff too much, but the idea here is to give you a sense of how the setting up of the ESF file works, because it is really important to make sure that it's done correctly, and there's certain assumptions that are in place with how the processing takes place. So now I will offer, do you have questions about anything I presented? Is a good time to go through that right now.